The Great Emo-Punk War of 2008 was a sight to behold. Emos on one side, punks on the other, coming together to fight in the holy battleground of Mexico. Hair was spiked and swooped to one side, belts were used as weapons, and hundreds of police officers took to the scene to attempt to keep the peace between warring factions of angry music lovers. It even scored a feature on international news, so prominent was the war between emos and punks. And it was organised via social media, of course, on forums and MySpace at the time. Bizarrely, at the end, it was disrupted by a bunch of singing Hare Krishna monks who inevitably calmed everyone down to the point that they all got up and left. However, the entire riot started because emos said they were getting abusive messages from punks and other areas of music culture, and this tied into the idea of emos being oppressed for dressing and acting differently to everyone else. So of course, it all snowballed until an all-out war was announced. There is truth in the fact that emos were often targeted back in the day for the way they dressed and acted. It was a huge difference from the norm at the time, as the emo men would often ditch the gym and go for a skinny, emaciated look with heavy makeup. This was an extremely subversive direction compared to the frosted blonde tips and more rugged looks of the early 2000s. Social outcasts could find a way to relate to one another by expressing themselves as people who didn't traditionally fit in. Being emo became an idea worth fighting for these social outcasts, especially in the face of targeted violence, and especially in the faces of older adults who said they didn't get it and didn't like it, turning the identity of emo into an act of rebellion against authority and the mainstream. So now that we have some context as to the existence of emo and its influences, as well as the fact that it had been targeted by other groups, we can start to put together the pieces regarding why a war began in Mexico between two hordes of passionate teenagers and adults alike, obsessed with music and identity. It all began on social media, when threats were thrown over MySpace from Mexican punks to Mexican emos. The idea was that they'd be lynched or killed or beaten up specifically because they were a part of emo subculture. At that time, many genuinely hated emos or made fun of them, which of course would only fuel the feelings of the emos as tortured souls. Apparently, much of the hatred toward emos came from their less masculine presentation. The fact that they'd style their hair or wear eyeliner meant a drastic departure from what was considered normal at that time, and so some assumed that identifying as emo meant you were homosexual, and that simply couldn't do. Remember, this was back in the day when wearing skinny jeans or performing any self-care as a man like washing frequently or trimming a beard was described as metrosexual, a play on homosexual, as looking after yourself was considered something that only a gay man would do. Emos at the time were thus called emosexual, which is pretty on the nose. Popular online groups existed at the time that discussed the emo subculture, and many were certainly not friendly or accepting of their existence, which only fueled the flames of hatred toward the mopey teenagers. Unfortunately, on March 7th, 2008, a popular hangout spot for emos was targeted by a mob of anti-emos, and several were actually beaten pretty badly. Time magazine covered this with the article "Mexico's Emo Bashing Problem." Journalist Joan Grillo, famous for covering hardcore stories about cartels in Mexico, said blogs raved about killing emos and showed cartoon drawings of decapitated long-haired heads. Internet writers called on anti-emos to take back public spaces such as the Plaza de Armas in Querétaro, where the black-clothed teenagers sit around. I also have to thank Joan for uploading a fantastic level of footage regarding the event, fully covering the war and interviewing tons of emos and locals about their thoughts and feelings, so I'd hardly recommend watching the entire thing. Eventually, the emos decided they'd meet up and march to protest against their torment, which led to a massive riot as police showed up in their hundreds to prevent more violence. At this stage, punks and other subcultures met the emos and the groups began yelling at one another, throwing various items and then eventually attempting to fight. As journalists recorded the scene and gave various interviews, with it seeming like the fighting would continue to escalate, the entire thing was eventually stopped as Hare Krishna monks danced through and everyone decided to go home. Honestly, it's the most ridiculous story, but it's one of those moments that proves the ridiculous can become true thanks to internet culture facilitating the fight. The crazy thing is that a lot of this stuff was documented online and covered by news stations, so it's not as if it's all been lost to time. You can still find the grainy footage uploaded in 2008 on YouTube. But there's more to the story here. We gotta dive into what makes an emo emo and how the entire subculture began. Emo subculture has had several booms and busts over the years, and seems to explode into popularity whenever things start getting particularly dire. Whilst it's generally accepted that the 2008 global financial crisis led to the emo subculture becoming far more mainstream in the early 2000s, thanks to a prevalent sense of doom and gloom bleeding out from the lack of optimism for the future, it has its roots in the 1980s. This is because the mid-80s were rife with horrific events and uncertainty. The decade marked the Cold War between the US and Russia, which gave everyone a persistent feeling of doom, as if nuclear Armageddon could erupt at any time. Plus, the stock market crash of '87, otherwise known as Black Monday, led to rampant instability and another depression. Not to mention fear surrounding the AIDS epidemic, which led to even more paranoia and uncertainty, which meant that society was extremely emotional. All of these elements led to the production of music known as emotional hardcore. It was a feeling expressed by bands such as Rites of Spring, which is widely credited as one of the inventors of the emo genre. Bands were suddenly making their music a little more artsy, a little more emotional, and a little more whiny, as a response to a scene that was quickly becoming more and more hardcore punk, and people began to really resonate with that. Then, in what is called second wave emo, spanning from the early 90s to roughly 2001, indie rock and alternative began permeating its way into the scene. Then, when the third wave finally struck, from about 2001 to 2009, emo went properly mainstream, and bands like Fall Out Boy and My Chemical Romance became associated with the genre. The third wave was noticeably marked by a distinct sense of hopelessness across the world, as major events like 9/11, the War on Terror, and the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis occurred, mirroring the issues of the 80s with the Cold War and Black Monday, providing ripe conditions for the emotional subculture to rise to the surface yet again. Teenagers the world over became obsessed with dressing all in black, with sad lyrics posted onto MySpace and Facebook, and defining themselves as social outcasts, despite the fact that sometimes very popular kids would dress this way too. Crying in your room, wearing makeup, and styling your hair in a certain way became classic activities for teens, and many felt misunderstood and hated for it. It was then that we find ourselves at the heart of the Emo-Punk War of 2008, as the two genres of music found themselves back in their oppositional roots, as the emo response to punk's popularity in the 80s had found its way into the 2000s. However, it's worth noting that the emo subculture is not dead in the 2020s. There was an exhibition at the Barbican Centre in London marking the emo period from the 2007 era, called I'm Not Okay. It expertly depicted the mindset of teenagers at the time, with full-on music memorabilia, bedroom selfies, music ticket stubs, and everything that an emo from around the world, including Mexico, might have had at the time they went to war against the punks. However, what made the Emo-Punk 2008 war so special is that it reminded many, especially within the United States, that Mexicans are more than the sum of their stereotypes, as well as the fact that the footage had become something of a time capsule to look back on. People all over the world want to identify with something bigger than themselves, and when their movements become fashionable as a form of self-expression, you end up with hordes dressed as emos defending their right to be so. The teenagers depicted in newsreels and clips wouldn't look out of place anywhere else on Earth during 2008, as the third wave of emo became so widespread as an idea expressed through not only fashion, music, and ideas, but also social media at that time, allowing teenagers to connect across the world at anywhere, anytime. However, at the end of the day, emo hasn't really gone anywhere. It's still prominent, just in different forms, and the idea that it comes in waves seems a bit misrepresentative. You'll still find teenagers and adults alike identifying as emo in their own way, and the subculture exists in all corners of social media, but perhaps it's simply not as popular as it once was in the early 2000s. In short, the Great Emo-Punk War of 2008 may have been utterly ridiculous from an outsider's perspective, but as it turns out, the emos had good reason to feel ostracized from society, as they were literally being beaten by mobs of people upset with their very existence. See you next time on Lessons in Internet Culture.